The funeral director asked me twice if I wanted to hold the service, and twice I told him no, because I still believed Grant was 10 minutes away. He wasn't 10 minutes away. He was 41 miles away, in a hospital delivery room in Stamford, holding a stranger's hand while I stood in a black dress in front of 60 folding chairs, watching my father's casket wait for a man who had promised to be there. My name is Nora Callahan. I was 32 years old, senior project director at Callahan Design Group, the architecture firm my father built from a 2-desk office above a dry cleaner into a firm with 40 employees and a client list that included half the boutique hotels on the eastern seaboard. My father, Walter Callahan, had died 9 days earlier of a heart attack in his own kitchen, a coffee cup still warm on the counter when I found him. I had spent those 9 days choosing a casket, writing an obituary, calling relatives, and trying to remember how to breathe through the specific kind of grief that arrives without warning and doesn't leave room to prepare. Grant Sinclair was supposed to be beside me for all of it. We had been engaged for 14 months. He was the firm's CFO, a role my father had personally recruited him for 6 years earlier, back when Grant was a sharp, ambitious finance guy at a competing firm, and my father used to say, only half joking, that hearing him was the smartest thing he'd ever done for the company and later for me. That morning, I texted him at 8:14. Service starts at 10. Don't forget the reading. Love you. He read it. The little gray read appeared under the message at 8:16. He didn't respond. At 8:40, I called him. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I told myself he was driving, that reception was bad on the parkway, that he'd walk through the chapel doors any minute now with that apologetic half-smile he used whenever he was running behind, the one that always made people forgive him instantly. At 9:50, 10 minutes before the service, I called again. Voicemail. My Aunt Carol found me in the vestibule, twisting the strap of my purse so hard the leather had started to crease permanently. "Is he coming?" she asked, and I said, "Of course he's coming," in a voice that didn't sound like mine. He did not come. I delivered my father's eulogy alone, standing where I had imagined Grant standing beside me, his hand resting on the small of my back the way it had at every important moment of the last 6 years. The day my father made him partner track, the night he proposed at the restaurant where my parents had their first date, the morning we buried my mother 11 years earlier, back when he was just a boyfriend and still somehow more present than he was now, as my fiancé. At the second worst day of my life. I got through it. I don't remember most of what I said. I remember my hands were steady, which surprised me, and I remember thinking, somewhere in the middle of a sentence about my father teaching me to read blueprints at the kitchen table, that steadiness is sometimes just shock wearing a nice dress. He called at 11:53, as the last of the guests were filing out of the reception hall with their paper plates of egg salad sandwiches. I stepped into the hallway to take it, half relieved, already composing the version of myself that would forgive him, because grief makes you desperate for anyone who says they love you to prove it, even late. Nora, his voice was strange, too bright, underneath something enormous. Nora, she had the baby. I stood very still. Who had a baby, Grant? A pause. In the background, I could hear machines beeping, the low murmur of a hospital hallway, and then, unmistakably, a woman's voice, exhausted and warm, saying, "Is that her? Tell her I'm sorry, tell her congratulations, tell her." "Brianna," he said. "Brianna had the baby, 6 pounds, 4 ounces. A boy. Nora, I know the timing is, I know today was hard, but I couldn't leave. She was alone. Her mom couldn't get a flight in time, and I was the only person there, and I couldn't just walk out in the middle of." "You weren't at my father's funeral," I said. The sentence came out flat, like I was reading it off a card. I know, and I'm sorry, but Nora, you have to understand, this isn't something I could reschedule. A baby doesn't wait." Neither did my father's casket. There was a silence on the line long enough that I heard the hospital paging system announce a code somewhere down the hall, calm and mechanical, utterly indifferent to the fact that my entire understanding of my life had just come apart in a hospital corridor, 41 miles away from where I was standing. "Don't be like this," he said finally, and his voice had shifted, gone from apologetic to faintly wounded, the tone he used when he felt he was being unfairly accused of something. "This is exactly the kind of thing I need you to be supportive about. I've told you from the beginning that Brianna and I share custody of this. It's not romantic. It's co-parenting. I thought you understood that." I want to tell you I hung up right there, that I found some clean, cinematic line to end the call with dignity. I didn't. I stood in a hallway that still smelled like carnations and stale coffee, my father 9 days dead, and I asked the only question my brain could produce. "You knew the due date was close to the funeral. You knew that before today." "I didn't think she'd actually go into labor on the same day," he said, like that was an answer. What was I supposed to do, Nora? Tell a woman in active labor that I had somewhere else to be? "Yes," I said. "That is exactly what you were supposed to do. You were supposed to be somewhere else. You were supposed to be with me." He sighed, the particular sigh of a man who believes he is being extraordinarily patient with someone who is being extraordinarily unreasonable. "I'll come by tonight. We'll talk. I know you're grieving, and I know today was, I know. But I need you to try to see this from my side, too." I hung up without answering. I don't remember deciding to. My thumb just found the red circle and pressed it, and then I stood in that hallway alone until my Aunt Carol came to find me, took one look at my face, and didn't ask a single question. She just put her arm around me and walked me back into the reception, where 60 people were eating egg salad sandwiches under fluorescent light. None of them yet knowing that somewhere between the eulogy and the burial, my life had quietly split into a before and an after. To understand how I ended up standing in that hallway, you'd have to understand who Grant was before he became the man who chose a hospital room over my father's funeral. Because he wasn't always that man, or if he was, he hid it so well that I spent 6 years mistaking patience for love. I met Grant when I was 26, freshly promoted to project manager at my father's firm, still young enough to think that competence and affection were the same currency. Grant came in as CFO not long after, hired away from a mid-sized development firm downtown, and my father adored him almost instantly. Walter Callahan did not warm easily to people. He'd built the company from nothing, survived 2 recessions and a lawsuit that nearly bankrupted him in his 40s, and he trusted numbers more than he trusted charm. But Grant had both. He could walk into a budget meeting and make a room full of architects, who resented anyone who talked about money instead of design, feel like he was on their side. He remembered everyone's coffee order. He remembered my father's late wife's birthday and sent flowers to the office every year on the anniversary of her death. A gesture so specific and thoughtful that my father started introducing him to clients as practically my son before Grant, and I had even gone on our first date. We started seeing each other 8 months after he joined the firm. I told myself I'd waited a respectable amount of time, that it wasn't unprofessional, that my father's approval of him professionally had nothing to do with how quickly I fell for him personally. I believed that for years. I'm less sure of it now. Grant was easy to love in the specific way that people who are good at reading a room are easy to love. He knew how to be exactly what a situation required. At my mother's funeral, when I was 21 and he was still just the boyfriend my father hadn't fully decided about yet, he'd driven 2 hours through a snowstorm to be there, sat beside me through the entire service, and held my hand so tightly my fingers went numb. I remembered that. I built a lot of trust on that single afternoon, the way you sometimes build an entire understanding of a person on one good moment, and then spend years refusing to update it. Brianna Voss came up occasionally in the early years, the way an ex sometimes does, a name mentioned in passing. A story about a relationship that ended before I existed in his life. He told me they dated for 2 years in his late 20s, that it ended badly, that she'd moved to Connecticut afterward, and he rarely heard from her. I had no reason to think about her again until 8 months ago, when Grant told me, over dinner, in the careful, rehearsed tone of someone who had practiced the sentence in the car, that Brianna had reached out, that she was pregnant, that the baby was his. I remember exactly where we were sitting, a corner booth at the Italian place near our apartment, the one with the candles stuck in the old wine bottle. I remember setting down my fork very slowly and asking him to say it again, because I wanted to make sure I'd heard him correctly, and he had, and I had. "It happened before us," he said quickly, before I could speak. "Nora, I swear to you this was before we were even together. We'd broken up for a few months, right before I started at the firm, and it was one night. I didn't know. She didn't tell me until now." "She's due when?" "October." I did the math without wanting to. 8 months pregnant meant conception in February. We had been engaged since November. I said this to him, quietly, and watched his face do something complicated. Not quite panic, not quite guilt. Something closer to a man recalculating a story in real time. "The timeline's a little blurry," he said. "She wasn't sure exactly when, but Nora, it doesn't matter when. What matters is there's a baby, and I'm not going to be the kind of man who isn't in his kid's life. You know that about me. That's part of why you love me." It was, in fact, part of why I loved him. That was the cruelest part of the whole thing, that he was using the truest thing about himself, the thing I most admired, as a shield against the question I actually needed answered, which was not will you be a good father, but were you faithful to me? I asked him directly. He told me no, absolutely not, that Brianna was a closed chapter, that this was only ever going to be about the child, co-parenting, logistics, nothing more. I wanted to believe him so badly that I did the thing so many women in my position do. I decided that believing him was easier than the alternative, and I built the rest of the year around that decision. I went with him to 2 prenatal appointments, sitting in the waiting room like a good, modern, evolved fiancé while he went in with Brianna, because he said it would upset her to have me in the room, and I told myself that was reasonable. I helped him pick out a crib. I told myself this was what generosity looked like. My father never knew the full truth. I told him only that Grant had a child coming from a past relationship, framed it as ancient history the way Grant had framed it to me, and watched my father's face do something careful and searching before he said, "As long as you're at peace with it, Nora," in a tone that suggested he was not entirely at peace with it himself, but had decided, as he often did with Grant, to extend the benefit of the doubt. I have thought about that conversation more times than I can count since the funeral. I have wondered what my father actually saw, and whether the searching look on his face that day was the beginning of a doubt he never got the chance to finish having. Grant came to my apartment that night, the night of the funeral, at 9 o'clock, still in the same collared shirt he'd apparently worn to the hospital, a small gift bag from the hospital gift shop in his hand. A stuffed elephant, I noticed later, still tagged, meant for the baby, which he set down on my kitchen counter without seeming to register how strange it was to bring it into my apartment at all. "I brought you soup," he said, holding up a paper bag from the deli near the hospital. "You didn't eat today." "You weren't at my father's funeral," I said again. It was the only sentence my body seemed capable of producing that day, the way a bruise keeps announcing itself no matter how many times you press on it. "I know, I've said I'm sorry." He set the soup down next to the elephant. "Nora, I need you to understand something. I love you. I am marrying you. But I also have a son now as of 11 hours ago, and I need you to be able to hold both of those things without punishing me for the timing. This wasn't a choice between you and him. It was one afternoon. It was my father's funeral. And I will grieve with you for as long as you need," he said, and he said it so gently, so reasonably, that for one disorienting second I almost apologized to him. That is the particular danger of a man who is good at sounding reasonable. He can make his own failure sound like your overreaction, and he can do it while looking genuinely wounded, as though you are the one causing harm. "I need you to leave," I said instead. He looked stunned, like the thought had never crossed his mind as a possibility. "Nora, come on, you're exhausted. You're grieving. Let's not make any big decisions tonight." "I'm not making a decision. I'm asking you to leave my apartment." He left eventually after a long stretch of him apologizing in slightly different phrasings, testing which version might land, none of them landing. At the door, he turned back and said, "I know today was about your dad. I get that. But I hope eventually you'll be happy for me, for us. This is a good thing that happened, even if the timing was terrible." I closed the door without answering. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table my father had taught me to read blueprints on when I was 9 years old, tracing the grain of the wood with one finger, and I thought about the word he'd used. Us. Not me and Grant. Him and Brianna and the baby. I hadn't been in that sentence at all. 2 days later, still moving through the fog of the first week without my father, I found the folder. It was an accident, or it felt like one at the time. I was looking for our joint account statements. I needed to reimburse Carol for the flowers she'd ordered for the service, and I opened Grant's laptop, which he'd left charging on my kitchen counter, to check an email he'd forwarded me about the caterer's final invoice. The laptop was already open to his email, no password required, because we had never kept things like that from each other, or I had never kept things like that from him. There was a folder in his inbox labeled, simply BV Misc. I want to be honest about why I opened it. I didn't open it because I suspected anything specific. I opened it because grief strips away the part of you that respects boundaries, and because some instinct older than logic told me to look before I let myself feel guilty about looking. Inside were 17 emails, going back 11 months, wire transfer confirmations, an apartment lease in Stamford, Connecticut, co-signed by Grant Sinclair, dated the previous December, 3 weeks before he proposed to me at the restaurant where my parents had their first date. A message from Brianna, sent in March, that read, in part, "Thank you for covering the deposit again. I don't know what I'd do without you. You've always shown up for me." I sat at my kitchen table with my father's blueprints table under my hands and my fiancé's laptop open in front of me, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after 3 days of chaos, that the funeral had not been the beginning of the lie. It had only been the day the lie finally became too big to keep hidden. I closed the laptop. I did not confront him. I did not cry, not yet. I picked up my phone instead and called the one person I knew would not tell me to calm down, would not tell me to give him the benefit of the doubt, would not tell me that grief was making me see things that weren't there. I called my father's attorney. "Nora," Denise Ashford said. When she picked up on the second ring, her voice warm but immediately alert, the voice of a woman who had known my father for 22 years and had heard something in mine that told her this wasn't a condolence call. "What happened?" I looked down at the laptop, closed now, humming faintly on the counter, the stuffed elephant still sitting beside it with its price tag hanging from one ear. "I need you to tell me what my father's will actually says," I said. "All of it, every clause, and I need you to tell me whether Grant's name is anywhere in it." There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of a lawyer who has just realized a conversation is about to become much larger than the reason she picked up the phone. "Come to the office tomorrow morning," Denise said. "Bring coffee, this is going to take a while." Denise Ashford's office smelled like old paper and the peppermint tea she'd been drinking since I first met her, back when I was 21, and she was helping my father settle my mother's estate. She had a corner office on the 9th floor with a view of the harbor, and she kept a framed photo of my parents on her bookshelf from some fundraiser 20 years ago, my father laughing at something off camera, my mother's hand on his arm. I hadn't noticed that photo in years. That morning, I couldn't stop looking at it. I brought the coffee she'd asked for. I did not tell her about the folder on Grant's laptop yet. I wanted to hear what she had to say first, uncontaminated by what I already suspected, because some instinct told me that the shape of the truth would matter, that I needed to know what my father had built before I understood what was being taken apart. "Your father called me 11 days ago," Denise said, once we were seated, once she'd poured her tea and folded her hands on the desk in the deliberate way she did when she was about to say something that required precision. "He asked me to draft an amendment to the company's operating agreement. He wanted a meeting the following Tuesday to review it and sign." "What kind of amendment?" "One that would have removed Grant's signing authority on all company accounts above $50,000, effective immediately, pending what your father called an internal review." She watched my face carefully as she said it. "He didn't tell me what prompted it. He just said, and I remember this exactly, because it struck me as an odd thing for your father to say about a man he'd treated like a son for 6 years. He said, 'I want the door shut before anyone notices I'm closing it.'" I sat very still. When was that Tuesday meeting supposed to happen? Denise looked down at her calendar, though I suspected she already knew the answer and was only giving me a moment before she said it. The day after he died. The room went quiet except for the low hum of the building's ventilation system. Outside the window, a ferry crossed the harbor, small and indifferent, the way the world keeps moving through the exact moments when yours stops. He never got to sign it, I said. No, which means legally nothing changed. Grant's signing authority is still active. He can move money on the company's accounts up to the threshold your father set years ago, same as he always could. Denise slid a folder across the desk toward me. I pulled the original agreement last night after you called. I want you to read it yourself, not just take my word for it, because what you decide to do next depends on understanding exactly what he can and can't touch. I read it. My father had structured the company carefully. The way he structured everything, slow, deliberate, allergic to leaving loose ends. But there was one loose end, and it was Grant. 6 years of trust had translated into 6 years of expanding authority. Signing power on operating accounts, access to vendor contracts. A seat that, on paper, made him nearly as powerful inside Callahan Design Group as I was, despite the fact that I was my father's only child, and per the will Denise walked me through next, the sole heir to his 61% ownership stake. He left me controlling interest, I said, half to myself. Grant doesn't own any of the company. Grant doesn't own a share of it, Denise agreed. But ownership and access aren't the same thing, Nora, and that's the distinction your father was trying to correct before he died. Grant has never needed to own the company to move money through it. He's had the keys for years. Your father just finally decided to take them back. I thought about the folder on Grant's laptop. The apartment lease, cosigned, dated 3 weeks before he proposed to me. The wire transfer confirmations. I thought about my father's voice, the one I'd never hear correct me again, saying I want the door shut before anyone notices I'm closing it, and I understood, with a kind of cold clarity that felt almost like relief after 4 days of grief with no edges, that my father had seen something. That some instinct, honed over 4 decades of building and protecting a business from people who wanted pieces of it, had told him to look closer at Grant, and that whatever he'd found had frightened him enough to call his lawyer 11 days before his heart gave out. I told Denise about the folder then, all of it, the lease, the wire transfers, the message from Brianna thanking him for covering the deposit again, the word that told me this wasn't the first time, that there was a pattern with a history longer than 11 months. Denise listened without interrupting, the way she always had, taking notes on a legal pad in handwriting so neat it looked typed. When I finished, she set her pen down and looked at me for a long moment. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to actually think about it before you answer, she said. Do you want to leave him, or do you want to punish him and then still marry him? The question landed harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to answer immediately. Of course I wanted to leave him. How could she even ask? And then I closed it again, because some small, humiliated part of me was still turning the funeral over in my head, looking for an angle that made it survivable. The way you press on a bruise not because you enjoy the pain, but because you can't quite believe it's really there. I don't know yet, I admitted. I know I'm furious. I know what I found on his laptop makes me sick, but I've loved him for 6 years, Denise. I don't know how to just turn that off in 4 days. You don't have to turn it off today, she said, not unkindly. But I need you to understand something before you do anything else. If Grant senses that you're building a case against him, whether that's a legal case, a financial case, or just the case you're making in your own head for walking away, he's going to move fast to protect himself. Men who have had 6 years of unquestioned access don't give it up quietly. So whatever you decide it before he knows you're deciding it. I nodded. It was, I would come to understand over the following weeks, the single best piece of advice anyone gave me through the entire ordeal, and I nearly didn't take it, because 2 days after that meeting, Grant handed me a stack of papers at my own kitchen table and asked me to sign them, and for one terrible, exhausted moment, I almost did. He came over on a Thursday evening, a week and a half after the funeral, with takeout from the Thai place we used to order from on nights neither of us wanted to cook, and a leather folder I recognized as the company's, the same kind my father used for board documents. "I know things have been strange," he said, setting the folder on the table between the takeout containers, "but there's some administrative stuff we need to handle. With your dad gone, some of the accounts need updated signatories, insurance beneficiaries, that kind of thing. I had legal draft it so we wouldn't have to think about it in the middle of everything else. I figured the least I could do is take one thing off your plate." He slid the folder toward me, already open to a tabbed page, a pen resting on top like a small, patient trap. I looked at the document. It was titled Temporary Executor Assistance and Signatory Authorization, dense with the kind of language that reads like nothing and means everything, the kind of paragraph my father had spent his whole career teaching me to read twice. I thought about Denise's face across her desk. He is going to move fast to protect himself. "What exactly does this do?" I asked, keeping my voice light, the way you keep your voice light when you're circling something you don't yet want the other person to know you're circling. "It just streamlines things while the estate's in probate," Grant said. "Otherwise, every check, every vendor payment, every payroll run has to wait on you personally signing off. And you're grieving, Nora. You shouldn't have to be doing that right now. This just lets me keep things moving on your behalf until everything's settled." Signing off. I looked at the tabbed page again, more carefully this time, and found the sentence I'd been half expecting, buried in the third paragraph, phrased so blandly it nearly slid past me. "Signatory hereby grants assistant full and independent authority over all operating accounts without dollar threshold, effective upon execution, for the duration of the estate administration period." No dollar threshold. My father had capped Grant at $50,000 for 6 years, a number he'd chosen deliberately, the way he chose everything. This document erased the cap entirely and handed Grant unrestricted access to every account the company held, at the exact moment I was most exhausted, most grieving, least likely to read every word. I set the pen down without picking it up. "I want to have my own lawyer look at this first," I said. Something flickered across Grant's face. There and gone so fast that a week earlier I would have missed it entirely, would have chalked it up to concern or tiredness. Now I recognized it for what it was: alarm. "You don't need to loop in outside counsel for something this routine," he said, and his voice had that particular smoothness again, the tone he used when he needed a room to agree with him quickly. "It'll just slow everything down. And honestly, Nora, it kind of stings that you'd bring in a lawyer for paperwork between us. We're getting married. This is just business housekeeping." "Then it won't take Denise long to confirm that," I said. "I'll have it back to you by the end of the week." He didn't argue further, not that night, but he stood up from the table sooner than he'd planned to, left half his pad tie untouched, and kissed my forehead at the door with a distraction that told me his mind was already somewhere else, already running calculations I wasn't privy to. I called Denise the next morning before I'd finished my coffee. I read her the paragraph over the phone, word for word. There was a long pause on the line. "Nora," she said finally, "if you'd signed that, Grant would have had unrestricted, unilateral access to every dollar your father's company holds, with no oversight, for as long as it took the estate to close, which, given how these things go, could be a year or more. He could move money anywhere he wanted and you would have no legal recourse to stop him, because you'd have signed it yourself." "I didn't sign it." "I know. But Nora, I need you to understand what this tells us. He drafted that document, or had someone draft it, within a week and a half of your father's death. He brought it to you at your kitchen table with dinner, on a night he knew you were exhausted, and he asked you to sign it without reading it closely, using the exact language your father used when he asked me to draft the opposite protection 11 days before he died." Her voice had gone hard in a way I'd never heard from her before, the voice of a woman who had spent her whole career being calm and had just run out of patience for it. "This isn't administrative housekeeping. This is a man trying to do quickly, while you're grieving, exactly what your father was trying to stop him from doing at all." I sat at my kitchen table, the takeout containers from the night before still on the counter, and felt something in me go very still and very cold, the way the surface of a lake goes still right before it freezes over. "What do I do?" I said. It wasn't really a question. It was closer to a request for instructions, the kind you give a doctor, the kind that means tell me the next step because I no longer trust myself to choose it. "First," Denise said, "you go back to work and you act completely normal. Second, I want you to get me every financial record you can access without raising suspicion, vendor lists, account statements, anything with Grant's name on an approval line. Third, I know a forensic accountant who used to consult for your father years ago, back during the lawsuit in the 90s. Her name is Priya Nandakumar. She's discreet, she's fast, and she owes your father a debt she's told me more than once she'd like the chance to repay." Priya Nandakumar was a small, precise woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and a way of looking at a spreadsheet the way other people look at a crossword puzzle, like it was a pleasure to be solved rather than a chore to be endured. We met at Denise's office 3 days later, and I told her everything I could without falling apart in front of a stranger, which turned out to be harder than I expected, because grief and betrayal had started to braid together into something I didn't have words for yet. "Your father called me 2 years ago," Priya said once I'd finished. "Not about anything urgent, just a routine consult on the vendor approval process. He asked me, almost in passing, whether it was normal for a CFO to personally approve invoices from vendors with no public footprint, no website, no other clients, nothing. I told him it happens sometimes with small specialty contractors, but that it's worth watching. I don't think he acted on it then. I think now, knowing what you've told me, that he might have started watching after that conversation and just never told anyone what he found." She asked for 3 weeks. I gave her everything Priya asked for account statements Grant had never thought to hide from me because he'd never imagined I'd look. Vendor contracts pulled from the shared company drive under the pretense of an unrelated audit. I told our office manager was routine. Estate cleanup. 6 years of expense reports that I'd signed off on without a second glance because I trusted the man submitting them. While Priya worked, I did the other thing Denise told me to do. I went back to work, and I acted completely normal, which turned out to be its own kind of performance, one I got disturbingly good at. I sat across from Grant in budget meetings and asked about vendor timelines in a pleasant, professional voice. I let him kiss me goodnight. I let him talk, at dinner, about names for the baby. A conversation I sat through with my hands folded in my lap, and my face arranged into something he read as grief-numbed acceptance. Because it was easier for him to believe I was simply too devastated to fight than to consider that I might be watching him more closely than I ever had before. His mother, Diane Sinclair, called me twice that week. Diane had always been polite to me in the specific, careful way that meant nothing underneath it, the way you're polite to a colleague you don't particularly like but have to work with. The first call was a condolence call, brief and correct. The second call was not. "I heard you're being difficult about some paperwork," she said, no preamble, the way she always got straight to whatever point she'd called to make. "Grant's under a tremendous amount of stress, Nora. New baby, your father's passing, running the company essentially by himself while you're understandably not at your best. The least you could do is make things easier on him instead of dragging in lawyers over routine forms." "How do you know about the paperwork, Diane?" A small pause. Grant mentioned it. "I see," I said, and something in my voice must have carried more than I intended, because Diane's tone shifted, became brisker, more clipped. "I'll be honest with you, Nora, since we're being honest," she said. "This family has been through enough upheaval this year without you turning a legal formality into a war. Grant has a son now. That's a blessing, whatever the circumstances. I'd hate to see you let grief turn you into someone who punishes the people trying to help you." I thought about the leather folder on my kitchen table. I thought about the sentence with no dollar threshold. I thought about my father, 11 days before his death, telling his lawyer he wanted the door shut before anyone noticed he was closing it. "Thank you for calling, Diane," I said, and hung up before she could say anything else, because I had learned, in the space of 2 weeks, that the fastest way to lose your footing with people like Diane and Grant was to let them keep talking until their version of events started to sound reasonable. Priya called on a Tuesday morning, 3.5 weeks after that first meeting in Denise's office. her voice tight in a way that told me before she said a single word that whatever she'd found was worse than I'd braced for. "Nora," she said, "I need you to come in today, and I need you to bring Denise. I've found a pattern going back nearly 2 years, and it's larger than either of us expected, and there's something else." She paused, and I heard papers shuffling on her end of the line, the sound of a careful woman deciding how to say something uncareful. "There's a name on 3 of these vendor contracts I think you're going to recognize, and it isn't Brianna Voss's name on the paperwork at all." The name on the contracts was Diane Sinclair. I stared at the printout Priya slid across Denise's conference table, at my future mother-in-law's name typed neatly into the authorized signatory field of an LLC called Meridian Holt Properties, and felt something in my chest go strangely quiet, the way a room goes quiet right before a storm arrives, all the noise sucked out of the air at once. "Meridian Holt Properties was formed 2 years and 4 months ago," Priya said, sliding a second document across the table, this one a printout from the State Business Registry. "Registered Agent is a law firm in Hartford that specializes in shell entity formation. Nothing illegal about the entity itself. Plenty of people use firms like that for legitimate reasons, but it's exactly the kind of structure you use when you don't want a casual search to connect 2 names. The listed members are Diane Sinclair and a G. Holt." "G. Holt," I repeated. "Grant's mother's maiden name was Holt," Denise said quietly, reading from a note she'd apparently already dug up before I arrived. "Diane Holt Sinclair. And Grant's middle name, according to the employment file your father kept on him, is Holton." I sat back in my chair. G. Holt. Grant, hiding behind his own mother's maiden name and his own middle name, close enough to disguise, far enough to deny. Priya walked me through the rest of it with the same clinical patience she'd probably used on my father's books 30 years earlier, when he was a younger man fighting a lawsuit he couldn't afford to lose. Over the past 26 months, Callahan Design Group had paid Meridian Holt Properties $612,000 across 11 separate invoices, each one categorized in the company's books as specialty consulting or vendor design services, categories vague enough that no one auditing the general ledger casually would think twice, especially because every single invoice had been personally approved and coded by the company's own CFO. Grant. "There's no consulting happening," Priya said. "I checked. Meridian Holt Properties has no employees, no office, no website, no other clients. What it has is 3 properties. A 2-bedroom condo in Stamford, purchased 18 months ago. A small multi-family building in New Haven, purchased 11 months ago. And a renovation loan on a lake house in the Berkshires, taken out 4 months ago." She looked up at me over her reading glasses. "The Stamford condo is the one currently leased to Brianna Voss." I thought about the elephant on my kitchen counter, still there, because I hadn't been able to make myself throw it away or give it back. Some stubborn, wounded part of me keeping it as evidence of something I hadn't fully named yet. I thought about Grant standing in my apartment the night of the funeral, telling me this wasn't romantic. This was co-parenting. This was logistics. While, the entire time, he and his mother had been building a real estate portfolio on my father's dime, 3 properties deep, using my company's money to construct a life that had nothing to do with logistics and everything to do with a future he'd been quietly assembling behind my back for over 2 years. 2 years and 4 months, I said slowly. "Grant and I got engaged 20 months ago." "I know," Denise said, "which means this started before the engagement, before Brianna told him she was pregnant, at least according to his own timeline. Whatever this is, Nora, it didn't start as a response to a baby. The baby came along in the middle of something that was already running." I sat with that for a long moment. Somewhere in the last hour, the specific, personal pain of the affair, the humiliation of the funeral, the elephant on my counter, the image of him holding another woman's hand while I buried my father had started to reorganize itself into something colder and more structural. This wasn't a man who'd made one terrible choice and then panicked and lied to cover it. This was a man who had spent over 2 years methodically siphoning money out of a company that trusted him completely, using his own mother as a partner in the theft, and who had been sophisticated enough to disguise it well enough that even a careful man like my father hadn't fully connected the dots. only sensed, with the instinct of someone who'd spent 40 years reading people who wanted things from him, that something needed watching. "There's one more thing," Priya said, and something in her voice made both Denise and I go still. I cross-referenced the property closing date on the Stamford condo with a set of credit card statements Nora gave us, Grant's card, the one on your joint travel account. There's a charge for a florist in Stamford, and a charge for a hotel 3 miles from that condo, both dated 4 months before he told you Brianna was pregnant, and both dated 11 months after your engagement. The room went very quiet. "He told me the relationship ended before us," I said. My voice sounded far away to my own ears. "He told me the baby happened during a break, before he even started at the firm, that the pregnancy was the first he'd heard from her in years." Priya slid the credit card statement across the table without saying anything else. She didn't need to. The dates did the talking, the way dates always do, indifferent and exact, refusing to be argued with the way a person can be argued with. I picked up the statement and read the charges twice, 3 times, my eyes tracing the same 2 lines over and over as if repetition might change what they said. A florist. A hotel. 11 months into our engagement. Not a closed chapter. Not ancient history he'd handled with grace when it resurfaced. An ongoing relationship, running quietly underneath our life together the entire time he was picking out venues with me. The entire time he was standing beside me at my mother's grave anniversary, holding my hand. The entire time he was telling my father, at Thanksgiving, that marrying me was the best decision he'd ever make. "I want to know everything," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I felt. "Every property, every transfer, every date. I don't want to walk into whatever happens next only half-armed." Denise reached across the table, and for the first time since my father's funeral, took my hand, the way she might have taken my mother's hand 20 years earlier, in this same office, over some other crisis I'd never known about because that's what good lawyers and good friends do. They carry the worst of it quietly, so the people they're protecting only have to carry what's left. "Then let's finish arming you," she said. Marcus Reyes had retired from the Stamford Police Department 11 years earlier, and now ran a small investigations firm out of a converted garage behind his house. A fact I only learned because Priya had used him twice before, on cases involving business partners who developed expensive secrets. He was built like a man who'd spent 30 years being underestimated by people who assumed a soft-spoken guy in a cardigan couldn't possibly also be dangerous at his job. And within our first meeting, he'd asked more precise, uncomfortable questions than anyone else had in the entire month since my father died. "I only work within the law," he told me, in the same tone Priya had used about her spreadsheets, like it was simply the shape of the work rather than a moral position he needed credit for. "Public records, surveillance in public places, financial paper trails your attorney can legally obtain. I don't break into anything, I don't wiretap anything, and if what I find isn't clean enough to hold up, I tell you that instead of pretending otherwise." "I don't need anything illegal," I said. "I need the truth documented well enough that no one can argue with it." He nodded like that was the correct answer, the only answer he was interested in hearing, and got to work. Over the next 2.5 weeks, while I kept sitting across from Grant at budget meetings and letting him kiss me goodnight and nodding along while he talked about baby names, Marcus quietly built a timeline that made Priya's financial records look almost gentle by comparison. Grant at the Stamford condo 3, sometimes 4 nights a week, his car parked in the same reserved spot every time, sometimes overnight, sometimes leaving before dawn in wrinkled clothes he clearly hadn't planned on wearing home. Grant and Brianna at a pediatrician's office together, 6 weeks after the birth, holding the baby between them in a way that read, in the photographs Marcus took from a legal distance across the parking lot, less like co-parenting logistics and more like a family photograph nobody had staged. And Diane at the Stamford condo twice, once carrying grocery bags, once carrying what looked like a small gift, wrapped, the kind of visit a grandmother makes to a household she considers legitimate. "Your future mother-in-law isn't confused about what this is," Marcus said, laying the photographs out on his kitchen table like a man dealing cards. She's not being manipulated. She's an active participant. The LLC has her name on it. She's visiting the apartment her son's ex-girlfriend lives in like it's family. And 3 days ago, he slid one more photo across the table, this one of Diane and Grant sitting across from each other at a restaurant I recognized, a place Grant and I had eaten at twice. She met with him alone, for 90 minutes, 2 days after you told H.